it's impossible to understand mental illness exclusively in terms of biology, in terms of brains. That the interpenetration of the social and the psychological and the biological, they're so intertwined, it's like a chicken and egg problem trying to disentangle them. Unlike most animals, or to a greater degree than any other animal, we're born with very plastic brains. Our brains aren't fully formed. And what happens as we develop is that in lots of ways, our experience transforms the way our brains are wired. So the idea that you can distinguish something called the biology of somebody and their social experience is, to my mind, a serious mistake. The two things go together. And so when it comes to understanding mental illness, if you do what American psychiatry has done for the last 40 years and focus only on genetics and neuroscience, you're not likely to get very far. And in fact, despite spending tens of billions of dollars, the situation of people with serious mental illness over here, and where you are, come to that, has not really improved a great deal. I don't know the Australian situation in detail, but obviously you don't have any magic potions that we don't have. And the drugs, for example, that are widely used in psychiatry, the antipsychotics, the antidepressants, the anti-anxiety pills, aren't any psychiatric penicillin. They're not something that cures mental illness. At best, what they do, and one shouldn't minimize the importance of this, but I'll add some caveats, they do help for some people with the symptoms. They make the symptoms more bearable, more tolerable, in that sense, help people live more normal lives. But the problem is they also come with a whole host of nasty side effects. Some people are lucky and only get mild side effects, but for others, they get movement disorders, they get conditions that resemble Parkinson's disease. They gain enormous amounts of weight on the newer drugs. They may gain 30, 40, 50 pounds. Do you still use pounds, or are you now kilos? Pounds? Yeah.
Kilos.
Us too. We're very bad. Oh, well, but you know, lots and lots of weight. 20 or 30 kilos is a lot of weight to add. And when you add that much weight, you increase the chance of diabetes, of heart problems, of all kinds of metabolic disorders. And no surprise, if you look now at the lifespan of people with serious mental illness, as compared to the rest of us, they live on average 15 to 25 years less than we do. Speaking, fortunately, as somebody who's escaped the ravages of mental illness. And that gap has grown rather than shrunk. So that's not entirely psychiatry's fault. That's also the product of changes in social policy that have led to the neglect of people with serious mental illness. Nonetheless, if we had really effective treatments, you wouldn't see, you know, a 20-year age gap in age at death. So it's, you know, social things really matter. And if you're trying to construct, to go beyond simply searching for a cure, which is obviously something we'd all love to see, although it seems to be an infinitely receding target. But many of the problems of the mentally ill and of their families are deeply social in nature. And so in that sense, investigating how we can best ameliorate the social circumstances people are living in, how we might provide effective relief to families, for example, who are coping with a mentally ill member. Those things are all things sociology can contribute. But the other thing I'd say is my perspective is much more that of a historian, although I reside nominally in a sociology department. My whole career started with looking at the rise of the Victorian lunatic asylum and the emergence of psychiatry in England. And then I went back into the 18th century, and then I did a book on hysteria that went back as far as the ancient Greeks. And then I moved into the 20th century, and my book, Desperate Remedies, really is, I mean, 2/3 of it deal with the 20th century and the 21st and what's happened in that period. And when I began that work, which was, oh gosh, 40 years ago now, even a little bit more, it was a very understudied area, very curiously. When historians looked at mental illness, they were all concerned with loony bins, with the big asylums that dominated the landscape in the 1950s and for 100 years before that. So people hadn't paid an awful lot of attention, except maybe to things like shell shock in World War I.
Yep.
And when I began work in this area, the first things I stumbled across and started to research about were the kinds of desperate remedies that gave rise to my book title. I discovered people who gave malaria to mental patients, people who injected them with horse serum to give them meningitis as a way of curing their mental illness, people who used one of the great discoveries of early 20th century medicine, insulin, which transformed diabetes from a death sentence to a chronic illness. But if you gave people too much insulin, they lapsed into a coma. And some bright spark decided that putting people into comas might cure their madness. And so there were insulin coma clinics set up in Australia, all across the world. There was a scandal in Australia, as I recall, surrounding that. Someone else decided that if you had epilepsy, you didn't get schizophrenia. So why not artificially create epileptic fits, and that would drive out the schizophrenia.
ECT.
So first they did that by injecting a drug into people. And even the guy who pioneered this approach, an Austrian named Maduna, commented that once people were injected with this, they felt as though they were on the brink of dying. So imagine you're psychotic. The men in the white coats come and strap you down and inject something into you, and you think you're about to die. And that lasts for minutes, sometimes an hour, and then you convulse. And he said, well, don't worry about it, because they lose their memory for this after they've convulsed. Well, the convulsions were so severe, all the muscles of the body contracted violently. People's backs broke, people's hip sockets broke. And that was what led to a search for a more humane and reliable way of causing these seizures. And that's how we got electroshock, or ECT.
ECT.
And ECT is the only one of these desperate remedies that still survives today. It's controversial because of its possible effects on memory, and we don't know how the hell it works. But for certain patients with severe depression who are suicidal, some psychiatrists, but by no means all, still prescribe it. It's not a very common treatment. And now it's different because we sedate people, we put them under anesthetic, we give them breathing support, we give them a muscle relaxant. So all those fractures I was talking about don't happen anymore, but you're still passing electric currents through the brain with unknown effects, well-known effects, because there's a lot of evidence of memory loss. But there are also people who testify this has saved their lives, you know?
Yeah.
So there was that, and then perhaps the most famous example, and I'm sure you've seen Jack Nicholson's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah.
Almost everybody has seen that movie. There was lobotomy, which first of all involved drilling holes in people's heads using something like a butter knife to slice through portions of the frontal lobes of the brain. And that was done under local anesthetic, if you can believe it. So the patient was talked through the operation.
Conscious.
And the reason for that was that by trial and error, they didn't really know how much of the brain to slice. And they thought that when people started to become confused, that was the signal that you cut enough. If you didn't cut that to that point, they stayed mad. If you went beyond that, they turned into a vegetable. Well, sometimes they turned into a vegetable anyway, but so we had, and they kept transcripts of these. I reproduced one in Desperate Remedies where the guy's undergoing the operation and he keeps telling them to stop and they ignore him and he's operated on. And then there was another transcript where somebody's asked, tell me, Mr. Richardson, what's going through your mind right now? And there's a pause in the transcript. And then the guy says, a knife? Ouch, ouch. Think about that. So I started there, and then I thought, no, it's too easy to dismiss that as pre-science, and now we're all modern and scientific, and we use pills, not shocks, and not ice picks to the brain. And so I broadened the study, and eventually, as I say, brought it all the way up to the present, which meant, among other things, I had to talk about the collapse of the asylum, deinstitutionalization, the turning out of patients, what was called community care, which involved no community and no care either, as far as I could see in many cases. So that was a sort of shell game with no pea underneath the shells. And then further on, why was it that psychiatry in America, psychiatry right after World War II became Freudian, at least big portions of it, the academic portion and the high status, high reward private practice. You went to therapy, you sat on the couch and you talked, and supposedly that was going to relieve your problems. And psychoanalysis dominated American psychiatry from 1945 into the 70s. And then it suddenly collapsed and was replaced by a turn back to biology. So another thing I want to try to understand in the book is, why did psychoanalysis achieve that authority in America? Why was it in all the movies? Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound, Robert Redford's Ordinary People, all embody this kind of psychoanalytic turn. And then it collapses. So why and how did that happen? And remembering all the time that although the high status bit of psychiatry was talk therapy during those years, there were 500,000 and more patients locked up in these old Victorian asylums in the 1950s. And only gradually, and then at an increasing pace, did they vanish. And it was in that world, in the despised world of the asylum, where many of the psychiatrists in America were foreign medical graduates who weren't licensed to practice medicine in the US, except in these bins. That was where one of the major forces that undermined psychoanalysis emerged, because it was there that we got the modern drugs. And we got them kind of by accident. In fact, completely by accident. Nobody sat down and said, let's find a drug to treat mental illness. They happened upon something that had an effect on some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And then a little bit later, they were experimenting with drugs to treat people with serious tuberculosis, a very terrible disease that would make you or I, if we were suffering from it and it was fairly terminal, rather unhappy. And when these patients were given this particular drug, they started dancing around and were happy. And so we got the first antidepressant. If that lifted their mood, perhaps it would lift the mood of patients. So the drugs revolution, which began in the 50s and included the so-called minor tranquilizers, Miltown and then Valium and Librium in the 60s, Mother's Little Helpers, as the Rolling Stones talk about it, right? Those things came along, and that transformed a lot of psychiatric practice. And now it's become basically what American shrinks do. They dispense medication. They no longer, very, very few of them are involved with psychotherapy. And to the extent psychotherapy survives, which it does, it's been passed along to the non-medically qualified, to clinical psychologists with PhDs, most of whom are women and who are paid much less than their medical colleagues. So you have this very, very complicated picture that I had to tease about. And one of the other really nasty features of psychiatric history is that in the late 19th century, when it became apparent that the original promise to cure 70 or 80% of the patients in the asylum was never going to happen, right? So yes, 30 or 40% might emerge after a year somewhat better and able to be discharged. But what that meant was 60 or 70% stayed behind. And over time, a larger and larger fraction of asylums that grew larger and larger themselves was composed of patients who were on what the sociologist Irving Goffman called continuous treatment wards, or the back wards, or no treatment wards. And they were stuck there for years, if not decades, and exiting in a pine box usually. So, you know, when that became obvious, psychiatrists had to explain, hey, you promised us 70% cures, but you're hardly curing anybody. What's going on here?
In fact, you're probably making it worse.
Yeah, well, exactly, because the environment in those hospitals was not exactly therapeutic. So the response was to say, well, this is the time of evolutionary theory, the last third of the 19th century. This is evolution run in reverse. The mentally ill are defective human beings. They are degenerates, and the language got harsher and harsher. It's a good job we're not curing them, because if we release them, they'll go out and breed more of their kind. And they don't have the kind of inhibitions we sane people do. So we'll be overrun with them. So you lock them up, but that's very expensive. And someone says, well, why don't we sterilize them? So then they can't reproduce. And so America passes compulsory sterilization laws, and eventually a test case reaches the United States Supreme Court in 1927. It's a case called Buck versus Bell. A young woman has been sterilized. The case goes to the Supreme Court, and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's the Chief Justice and one of the most famous jurists in American history, delivers an 8-1 verdict saying 3 generations of idiots are enough. The state has the right to intervene and take away your ability to procreate, whether you like it or not. And it's that legislation that the Nazis seize on in 1933 when they passed their own sterilization law.
Exactly.
And they compulsory, lacking the constraints of a democratic society, they sterilized left and right and center. And then, just before the war breaks out, Adolf Hitler says, why are we supporting these people he calls useless eaters? They're never going to get better. They're just a drain on the public purse. Why not kill them all? And so the mentally ill were slaughtered by German psychiatrists. The leading German psychiatrists actively participated in the murder of 250,000 mental patients. That's where the technology of the gas chamber was developed. And the technicians and the showers and the gas chambers disguised the showers were then packed up and moved to the death camps for the final solution. So it's in that context of let's just kill them all or let's sterilize them that other psychiatrists tried all these desperate things I've talked about. Yeah. They wanted to be seen as engaging in therapy, in curing people, in being a healing profession. And there were no constraints on them. When you were mad, when you were certified as a lunatic, as the term was in the 19th century, or as a mental patient in the 20th, you lost all civil rights. You were shut up in a double sense of being shut up. You were locked away and your voice was stifled. What you said didn't matter because it was the product of your mad brain. And so we were licensed to experiment upon you and do whatever came into our heads with virtually no pushback. So one of the examples I talk about in the book, the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, is when germ theory triumphs in medicine.
Yeah.
So in general medicine, we finally think of disease as something called by nasty things called germs, bacteria.
Yep.
I haven't heard of viruses yet because I can't detect them. So there's some therapeutic breakthroughs associated with that. But what it does is cement medicine to the laboratory, increases the prestige of medicine. They finally can do something for some of their patients. And psychiatrists are kind of left in the dust. And they look around and some of them say, well, maybe what we deal with is caused by an infection. And then lo and behold, an important chunk of each asylum's admissions turns out to be suffering from some, well, that's been known for a long time in the 19th century, one of the few diagnostic breakthroughs of psychiatry in those years. There's something called general paralysis of the insane. And when that's identified, as its label suggests, what happens is you develop a mix of neurological and psychiatric symptoms. So on the one hand, you have trouble talking, you have trouble walking, your eyes stop reacting properly to light, you have all these symptoms that something physical is going wrong. At the same time as you're becoming a pitiable wreck who will eventually be paralyzed and die from bed sores or choking on your own vomit when you can't swallow anymore, there are these weird psychiatric symptoms. You think you're Jesus, or you're George Washington, or you're Mary, the Mother of God, or the sexiest man alive, or the richest man alive. So you have all these things, right? And some people think in the first decades that that's where all insanity ends if you live long enough. Others think this may be something different. And in the early 20th century, we discover what that difference is. These are people suffering from tertiary syphilis. Syphilis, the AIDS of the late 19th century, if you like, is a peculiar disorder in that when you first catch it, there are obvious symptoms: skin lesions, fevers, pain, discomfort, the whole 9 yards. But then it goes underground. And decades later, it may attack the heart, in which case, in middle age, some respectable banker keels over dead and everybody says overwork. Actually, it's the syphilis he contracted from a prostitute 20 years before. Or in other cases, it attacks the brain and the spinal cord, hence the paralysis, and hence the crazy idea.
Yeah.
So now we have a case, and that's about 20% of male admissions into asylums as people with tertiary syphilis. It's not a small problem. So that's an infectious cause of some kinds of madness. And then right after, towards the end of World War I, gets the bright idea that, well, he's had it for some while, that giving people a fever will somehow cure their mental illness. And he comes across an Italian prisoner of war, because the Italians are on the side of the good guys in World War I, who's got malaria. Malaria is then endemic in the Po Valley and around Rome. So this guy's got malaria, and he goes, here's a great way to give people a fever. And so he takes malarial blood and injects it into people with GPI and claims that the high spiking fever cures them. Now, in fact, we now know he fudged all those figures, but there's still debate about whether this treatment worked. We do know, for example, that the parasite that causes, the bug that causes tertiary syphilis or syphilis generally is vulnerable in vitro in a lab to high temperatures. If you get to about 105, 106, it dies. We don't know quite what happens in the body And in any way, if somebody's fever is around 105, 106, they're hovering on the brink of irretrievable brain damage.
Yeah, that's right.
But if you give them quinine, they may recover, as long as you've given them the right kind of malaria, which didn't always happen. So that technique wins the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1927.
Right.
And then they try using fever for other kinds of mental illness. They invent what they call diathermy machines, things that look a bit like a coffin with your head sticking out, and you're strapped into this thing, and they basically cook you until your ability to control your body temperature vanishes and your fever develops, right? And that was meant to cure other kinds of mental illness. It most certainly did not. But it's just indicative. So someone else comes along and says, well, I think the reason people go mad and they have these crazy ideas is because their brains are being poisoned. And how are they being poisoned? Because they have chronic infections in their bodies lurking about that are spreading to the brain via the bloodstream or the lymph and damaging it, eventually destroying it. Now, this isn't an era of antibiotics. And so how are you going to deal with that? You employ what Henry Cotton, the chief enthusiast, but by no means the only one for focal sepsis theory, as it's called. You employ surgical bacteriology. Let me translate that into everyday terms. You rip the bits out where the infections lurk.
Yeah.
So he starts.
I think I can see where this is going.
Close to the brain. Teeth.
Teeth.
Oh, we pull the teeth out. They don't get better. Tonsils, right adjacent to the brain. They still don't get better. Is that a bad theory? No. See, all those germs in their mouths, they've swallowed them. So we've got to take out stomachs and spleens and colons and cervixes. It's like mad science. And it persists for, more than a decade and a half until Cotton dies. And even then, it doesn't really stop. At Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, where this stuff had its headquarters, they were still pulling teeth and eliminating tonsils as a cure for mental illness in 1960. So not so very far back in history. And there was a study done at the time that showed that Cotton was killing people. Even when he published his results, he said, well, about 30% of the people who have abdominal surgery die, but they were going to die anyway, so don't worry about that. And nobody says, hey, wait a minute, you can't be killing 3 out of every 10 patients you operate on. In fact, he was killing nearly 45% of the patients who got the abdominal surgery. And in the midst of this, his mentor is asked to investigate what he's doing and sends a woman assistant along. And she spends 1.5 years and shows that the more treatment the patients get, the worse off they are, including dying. And when she presents the report, her boss suppresses it, doesn't allow it to see the light of day. And when the instigator of this approach, Henry Cotton, dies suddenly of a heart attack at his club one day, Adolf Meyer, who's the head of American psychiatry in those years and who has trained Henry Cotton, publishes the obituary in the American Journal of Psychiatry saying what a great loss it is to humanity and to the mentally ill that this guy has popped off prematurely. And he's the one that keeps all that under wraps. So professional self-controls didn't work. And that's one of the more dramatic examples of a desperate remedy that I talk about in the book. And this was an idea that was floating around in general medicine as well. When I was a kid, somehow I was spared having my tonsils removed, but virtually everybody else I knew had tonsils out. And a lot of that was the survival of this focal sepsis theory in general medicine. Really quite extraordinary. In Birmingham, in England, all the mental hospitals were under the authority of a guy named Thomas Chivers Graves. Graves is a very ominous last name. He ran those hospitals from 1920 until the late 1940s, and he believed in this stuff. And by golly, he couldn't afford to do the abdominal surgery, luckily, but they got colonic irrigations, they got sinuses operated on, teeth removed, tonsils removed. And eventually, after the war, when penicillin had been discovered, this guy says, oh, we don't need to have surgery anymore. We can use penicillin, except you couldn't get any. And so he grows mold in jar and injects it into his patients. No kidding.
I suppose I'll make an observation and get a comment. And I want to know if I'm understanding your work too. So, please obviously correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Sure.
I don't know what tool we should use to investigate and treat mental illness. And I'll explain and make a statement. I think it's because we're treating a phenomena. And I sometimes wonder if the scientific method alone is the best tool. Now, I'm not saying it has no place. Science evolved as a method of investigating matter and material, more than phenomena, a human phenomena, and that's where it's strongest. I suspect somehow this entire thing is linked with consciousness, but I'm not sure how. So, what?
Well, yeah, I think that mystery of mind and body is one the philosophers have wrestled with for thousands of years, and I don't think we've solved it. I don't think we're capable of it. I do think that, and this is almost where we started when you asked me what a sociologist had to contribute to the field. I do think that the social dimensions and the psychological dimensions of illness, mental illness in particular, can't be reduced to defective brains. And so I think effective research in this area has to be much more broad-based. That doesn't mean it doesn't that we can abandon science, whatever that means, but it does mean that if we get one-eyed about things, we're not likely to make the kind of progress that we should. So let me quote a very famous and very wise Harvard professor named Leon Eisenberg, who some years ago said, American psychiatry had gone from being a brainless psychiatry and was now a mindless psychiatry. So at the time of Sigmund Freud, we ignored the brain, we ignored the body. We just thought it was all a matter of psychological conflict and unconscious this and that running around. And now, he meant by the 1980s forward, we had concluded that the way forward was genetics and neuroscience, and that was that. And we could ignore the voices of the mentally ill. We could ignore the social circumstances that had some bearing perhaps on their troubles, and just concentrate strictly on biology. And that's what the National Institute of Mental Health, the NIMH, in this country has done since the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And when the director, not the current one, but the one immediately before him, Tom Insel, stepped down, he gave an interview and he said, look, I've run NIMH for 13 years and I've spent all this money. I've funded some really cool science. There's been some cool genetics and some cool neuroscience. And he said, I think I've spent $20 billion or so. And he said, the condition of the mentally ill and our treatments of them haven't advanced a bit. And he was entirely accurate when he said that.
Absolutely.
My reaction to that was, so his recipe was to keep doing the same thing. And that's one definition of insanity. My reaction was, maybe that shouldn't be the sole and singular process by which you approach these problems. Perhaps it's time for a broader thing. And in fact, it's really interesting. And it was one of the things I had to come to terms with. And I did an enormous amount of reading as an outsider, obviously. And so I consulted with some leading psychiatrists with whom I'm friendly and who I trust a good deal, when I'd finished that reading, and I said, this is the way I read what the genetic folks have discovered, which is there is no gene for schizophrenia. There is no gene for bipolar disorder or serious depression. And in fact, all the genetic work now with powerful new techniques, we've decoded the human genome, we have PCR to chop up bits of it so we can examine what's going on. All of that, when we dive in atheoretically and say, we'll add any information we can from any bit of the human genome, how much statistically does that account for schizophrenia, for example? 7 or 8% of the variants, leaving more than 90% not related. Worse than that, from their point of view, because for 100 years or more, we've been taught there's dementia praecox, which got largely relabeled as schizophrenia in about 1910. We have manic depressive illness, which is now bipolar disorder, and we have serious depression, right? And the expectation was these would have different genetic profiles. But in fact, what the genetic work seems to suggest is there's huge overlap. To the extent the genes matter at all, they give you a general disposition to some sort of mental trouble, but not necessarily schizophrenia producing schizophrenia. Yeah. Bipolar disorder producing more bipolar. So
surely that's an issue of
work. Well, so that's the other big problem. So the drugs have very serious side effects. Okay, let me, and they don't work for everybody. So let me talk briefly about a study. Most of the drug studies have been done by the drug companies, and they cook the data. They suppress the stuff they don't like. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but there have been any number of lawsuits that have shown they manipulate things, they mismarket things, they hide results they don't like. But if you take antipsychotics, the first generation, Thorazine and the like, Largactil as it was called in Europe, had a number of very serious side effects. For some people, they created symptoms that resembled Parkinson's disease. For others, they created involuntary movement disorders, generally called tardive dyskinesia, or they created an inability to stay still. And if you're in the presence of somebody who's constantly fidgeting and moving about, it's terrible, and it's terrible for them. And the tardive dyskinesia in particular, where you're jerky, spasmodic, your facial muscles are moving about, you're making quacking noises, people assume that you're mad, ironically, and it's a drug effect. So in the 90s, along came a new group of antipsychotics that were called, even though they're very different from one another, atypical or second generation antipsychotics. And in 2005, we had the results of a study where the new generation drugs were patented and much, much more expensive, but supposedly better because they cause less tardive dyskinesia. So there were 4 drugs in the study. One was a first generation drug, 3 new ones. 2 crucial findings at the end. The new drugs were just as bad as the old ones. Their side effects were different, but they included things like gaining 15 or 20 kilos and heart disease and diabetes and the like, right? And they still continued to produce a certain amount of tardive dyskinesia and so on. But the other interesting thing was this. Between 67 and 82% of the patients, depending on which of the 4 drugs they were on, dropped out of the study because the drugs weren't working or the side effects were intolerable.
Yeah.
So that, when I say we don't have a psychiatric penicillin, that's one piece of that puzzle. The other piece is this: the drugs, antipsychotics do some things that for some patients are very positive. They damp down the delusions and the hallucinations which are making our life a misery, all right? Those are what are perversely called the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. There's another group of symptoms associated with that label, which are called the negative symptoms. Language difficulty, muddled thought patterns, inability to deal with ordinary social interaction. None of the drugs we have work on those. And starting about a decade ago, the major pharmaceutical houses, having made billions and billions of dollars for a profit from these drugs, exited further research. They disbanded work on antidepressants and antipsychotics, said it's too risky. We've got better opportunities for profit over here and here and here. So shut all that down. So we've got inadequate treatments that aren't likely to improve. We have research in neuroscience and in genetics that, at least so far, hasn't led to any therapeutically useful further. And then we have the whole question of diagnosis. And psychiatry for the last 40 odd years has relied on a kind of tick the boxes approach to diagnosis. If you take these 10 symptoms and you have 6 of them, you are diagnosed as schizophrenic. If you have 5 of these 9 symptoms, you have depression, major depression. Well, it's actually 5 of 10 in that case, because one of the symptoms is you're sleeping all the time, or in the alternative, you're insomniac all the time. So let's look at that for a minute. That means you've got 10 symptoms and you need 5 of them. 2 patients get the same diagnosis. They may share not one symptom. And symptoms are a very awkward way to be diagnosing illness. That's what we used in the 18th century for all kinds of illness. Nowadays, we tend to have biological markers. We have tests, we have blood work, we have imaging. There isn't a single biological marker for psychiatric disease. We don't have one. And so we're forced back.
It's got to be symptoms.
On symptoms alone. And the idea that symptoms alone will define real things in nature is almost certainly a snare and a delusion. If you have a fever in the 18th century, that was a disease you had a fever. But the reason you had a fever could be multiple things. And so that's the same problem. So I have seen, major figures like Sir Robin Murray, who's a fellow of the Royal Society, former director of the Institute of Psychiatry in London, probably one of the most cited researchers into schizophrenia in the world, a guy who's even a little older than I am now. And I was chatting with Robin, and he said it in print. He said, I think within the next 10 years, the diagnosis of schizophrenia is going to disappear. Now, we've been taught, we, the general public, have been taught for over 100 years that schizophrenia is real. It's a separate illness. Bipolar disorder is a separate illness. It's real, just like pneumonia or tuberculosis or hepatitis. Now it turns out it's not. So you have treatments that are at best partially effective. You have a diagnostic system that's a mess. And you have fundamental research, which at least to date hasn't created the breakthroughs that they expected. So my argument at the close of Desperate Remedies is this is a profession with a real crisis on its hands. Not recognizing that, but it's really got problems. Further to that, one could argue, when you ask about social things, most of the diagnostic system that they use is that purports at least to be agnostic about what the causes of these various diseases is. Hundreds of them actually that exist in the DSM. We don't know where they come from. There is one exception, one major exception, and that is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. that, as its name implies, says the reason you have the mental disturbances you do is because of some past trauma and its effect on you. So it's very much a cause and effect kind of argument. We have this kind of thing. Now, how did that come to be? Well, it's an example of how war in particular has been good to psychiatry, if bad for the people fighting it and for everyone around. But what the stresses of war revealed is that people, perfectly healthy, perfectly normal people like you and me, under those terrible circumstances, in substantial numbers, break down. In World War I, we called it shell shock. In World War II, we called it combat exhaustion or combat fatigue or combat neurosis. Vietnam, the Vietnam veterans against the war said, we want something called post-Vietnam syndrome because we're having these flashbacks, we're having these angry fits, we're unlivable with. And it's the effects of this illegal war. And they pressured the American Psychiatric Association to include something called post-Vietnam syndrome. Now, this is in the years of Richard Nixon. Yeah. Politically, that was not doable. And the compromise, when the pressure got too great, was to say, okay, we'll allow something like this, but we're going to call it post-traumatic stress disorder, which means other kinds of trauma can produce mental breakdowns. Another recognition of the importance of the social, I might remind you.
Exactly.
And so initially that was hardcore trauma. Women who were raped or sexually assaulted, people who witnessed a parent being shot in front of them, all too common in this benighted country I live in, where the idea is any nutcase can have a gun as long as they're over 18. But it's easy for that to spread, for a process we can call diagnostic creep. Actually, it's an Australian academic whose name I'm blocking on, who proposed that notion, but it happens all through psychiatry. Instead of the initial core of we can all recognize, it sort of spreads. And so any kind of upset is potentially traumatic enough to demand the intervention of experts. So there we are. We have a very, very mixed and muddled and uncomfortable situation.
Yeah, so what about but you talk about the social and the psychological dimensions of mental illness. It seems to me to be, I don't really understand what you mean when you say the psychological dimensions of that. It seems like somewhat of a tautology. Can you tell me what you mean? Like it seems to be mistaking the word.
What I'm trying to get at there, and I'm not, as you will detect if you read my book, a Freudian. I don't believe in Freudian doctrines and the like. But one of the things the psychoanalysts did a bit, although they tried to push their patients' explorations of their mental universe into predetermined boxes, but they were listening to some degree to patients. And when I'm talking about the psychological, I'm saying that to some degree, mental illness exists at the level of meaning, at the level of the ways in which we construct our experience, whether that be emotional responses or more cognitive kinds of responses. So when I'm referring to the social, it obviously overlaps very much.
Yeah.
But we can talk about broader environmental things, poverty, insecurity, poor diet, and the rest. But on top of that, there's this, and this was one of the reasons why the Freudian system broke down. One of the ways they explained schizophrenia and autism was to say it's all the parents' fault, especially the mother's fault.
The mother's fault.
The concept of the so-called refrigerator mother, was widespread at this time. So your mother really doesn't want you, and she freezes you out emotionally, and that's what tips you over the edge, right? So imagine you're the parent of an adolescent with schizophrenia, or an adolescent with or a young child with autism, and you're told, this is your fault, you did it. And then someone else comes along and says, no, it's all a matter of neurochemistry. It's, in the case of depression, it's too little serotonin in your brain. So we give you this happy pill and then you'll be fine. Which are you going to choose? This system that blames you only and entirely,